This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 526 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. As you guys know, last week I talked all about breakout running backs in fantasy football. If you weren't able to hear the episode specifically on that topic and then the mailbag episode that followed, I'd go back and listen to those shows before this one. Today's show is about wide receivers. We know what to generally look for when spotting breakout running backs. And we now know there may be a way to really increase your odds on hitting on a breakout running back with the ambiguous RB1 theory. But what about wide receivers? I'll talk about that today. But before we get into the data, the Olympics are back, and FanDuel is giving fans an exclusive opportunity to get in on the action with the USA Gold Medal bonus. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel Sportsbook and place $100 or more in wagers on the Olympics prior to July 26th. You'll be awarded a $1 bonus in site credit for each gold medal the United States wins at the Olympics, regardless if your wager wins or loses. Show your support for Team USA and head over to FanDuel today. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, or Virginia. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max bonus $50. Restrictions apply. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Virginia, and the Tennessee Red Line, 1-800-889-9789. Like the running back study, I've looked into how to spot breakout wide receivers in the past. I've done 2 separate episodes on the topic on the Late Round Podcast. But the episode and study that I did last year was a little bit more detailed than the one before that. And just like the running back study, I started the wide receiver one by plotting wide receiver average draft position versus postseason result. So on the x-axis, you have where a wide receiver was drafted. On the y-axis, it shows how many points that player ended up scoring. This gives us a trend line of ADP expectation, or how many points we'd expect a wide receiver to score at a particular average draft position. From there, to get a breakout wide receiver sample, I looked at all wide receivers drafted after round 5, or pick 60, who exceeded expectation by 100 or more points. The reason I chose 100 points, that was sort of arbitrary. But I chose after round 5 because that's about where we see opportunity cost drop in fantasy football. Meaning we're starting to get into this area of the draft where there are a lot more question marks for players. From 2011 through 2019, that yielded 52 wide receiver breakouts. We did have 5 more wide receiver breakouts happen in 2020 as well, with Justin Jefferson, Chase Claypool, Robbie Anderson, Cole Beasley, and Curtis Samuel all exceeding ADP expectation by 100 or more points last year. But when I did the study last year, I obviously didn't have those players as part of the breakout sample. I looked into that 52 player sample and found some common trends. I found that just like the running backs, these breakout wide receivers seem to be coming from ambiguous wide receiver groups. Of the 52 players, 8 of them had a wide receiver teammate drafted in the first 2 rounds of fantasy drafts. The vast majority were on teams where the first wide receiver selected on that team came after round 4, hence the ambiguity. The second trend was that quarterback play didn't really matter or seemed to matter. It's not that it didn't matter at the end of the season, but if you're trying to tie your wide receivers to quarterbacks by ADP, it's not all that necessary. The quarterbacks for these breakout wide receivers averaged an ADP of QB 19. So again, maybe at the end of the season, they mattered and they were good. But at the start of the season, we weren't necessarily looking at them favorably, which could be why their wide receivers were being drafted outside the first couple of rounds. Trend 3 is that breakout wide receivers tend to be most impactful when they're young. To put this another way, the degree in which they broke out was more significant when they were in year 1 through year 5, with a focus on years 1 and 2. That was the case last year too. The 2 biggest breakouts, or players who exceeded expectation most, were rookies Justin Jefferson and Chase Claypool. Now the last trend is that breakout wide receivers rarely come from nowhere. Typically, these breakout players had some sort of target share during the previous season before that breakout year. If you look at what happened with Jefferson, Claypool, Robbie Anderson, Beasley, and Curtis Samuel, they seem to fit these trends. None of those players had teammates drafted in the first 2 rounds of drafts last year. They all almost had teammates drafted outside of round 3 as well, but DJ Moore and Juju Smith-Schuster were at the tail end of round 3. The quarterbacks were generally drafted later. And the non-rookie breakouts were coming off seasons where they had significant target shares. Cole Beasley had a share of 21% in 2019. Robbie Anderson's was 19.5%. Curtis Samuel's was almost 18%. And then, as I already mentioned with the last trend, the younger guys broke out at a more substantial rate, with Justin Jefferson and Chase Claypool exceeding expectation the most. I want to dig more into the ambiguous wide receiver group and the age thing a little bit more today. I do think that if you're drafting a non-rookie wide receiver with a middle or late round pick, you want some sort of backbone from the previous season. The median target share from the year before a player's breakout through the years over the last 10 years has been almost 17%. 2/3 of the qualified wide receiver breakouts hit at least a 15% target share the year prior to that breakout. For some perspective, that target share was hit by fewer than 50 wide receivers in 2020. So you're rarely working with breakout players who come from absolutely nowhere as non-rookies. A season like Tyrell Williams' 2016 or Terrell Pryor's 2016 or DJ Chark's 2019, they honestly don't happen very often. And don't pay too close attention to quarterback ADP when drafting your wide receivers. When a quarterback has wide receivers who have high ADPs, that quarterback is generally going to outperform expectation. I talked about that on episode 516. But breakout wide receivers are being drafted later and from ambiguous wide receiver groups. So it would make sense that the quarterback isn't necessarily highly regarded entering a season. I'm really interested if we can learn more about the age factor and then about the ambiguous wide receiver groups, similar to the running back breakout show. So that's what I set out to do, to look more into those two things. Let's start with the ambiguous wide receiver group trend. If you look at the 57 wide receiver breakouts, so I'll add the 5 that happened this past year, and you see where the top wide receiver from their NFL team was being drafted in fantasy, the average ADP of that player was pick 68. Now, some of the breakout wide receivers were their team's wide receiver 1 by ADP, to be clear. And just that I don't make the same mistake that I made with the running back episode, by team wide receiver 1, I'm referring to players who are the first wide receivers being drafted on their actual NFL team. So Justin Jefferson was not that last year. Adam Thielen was that for Minnesota. Whereas right now, Justin Jefferson is that. He is his team's wide receiver 1. Because in 2021, he's being drafted ahead of Adam Thielen. That's what I mean by team wide receiver 1s. It's strictly by ADP. I'm not guessing or predicting who the wide receiver 1 is going to be. Let's approach this the same way I approached the running back study. Let's look at every wide receiver who's been drafted after round 5 since 2011. And let's see if there's anything of substance between a player who's his team's wide receiver 1 versus a player who isn't. We've had a lot of wide receivers drafted after round 5 over the last 10 years. According to my fantasy league's ADP data in redraft leagues, we've had 768 wide receivers get selected after round 5 over the last decade. Of those 768, 119 of them were the first wide receivers drafted from their team. So you've got 119 team wide receiver 1s versus 649 wide receiver 2s or worse. Of the wide receiver 1s, 13 exceeded expectation by 100 or more points. That's a breakout hit rate of about 11%. Of the non-wide receiver 1s, we have 44 breakouts. That's a hit rate of under 7%. So from that alone, it seems like team wide receiver 1s are a better bet than team wide receiver 2s. But we have to keep in mind that there's probably some bias here. We're looking at expectation. So late round picks have lower expectation than a middle round pick. And most team wide receiver 1s are being drafted in the middle rounds. So how a player exceeds expectation, that's still all relative to ADP. But we also know that in the late rounds, we're drafting players who may not sniff a football field. We're throwing darts. So I don't think this is super shocking. I don't think the fact that wide receiver 1s are better than wide receiver 2s right now, given this data, that's not all that shocking. Even though expectation is relative to ADP. To sort of help this problem, I'll do what I did with the running back study. And that's look at a more apples to apples comparison. We'll look at the middle rounds, around 6 through 9. That represents pick 61 through pick 108. Since 2011, 15 of our breakout wide receivers have come from these middle rounds. Of those 15, 9 of them were drafted as their team's wide receiver 1, which remember is strictly determined by ADP. 6 of them were drafted as their team's wide receiver 2 or worse. That's the numerator of our fraction here. But what we're trying to figure out isn't just the raw number, it's the hit rate. So that numerator divided by some sort of denominator. Over this time frame, there have been 89 team wide receiver 2s or worse drafted in that range. So since 6 of them broke out, that's a breakout rate of 6 divided by 89 or 6.7%. Meanwhile, there's been 72 team wide receiver 1s drafted in this range. With 9 of them breaking out, that gives us a hit rate of 12.5%. To put this another way, you want team wide receiver 1s. They've almost had twice as good of a breakout wide receiver hit rate over the last decade versus the alternative. And yes, this is exactly what we saw with the running back sample analyzed last week. This is all backed by yet another study done by my friend Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis. He wrote that since 2010, 78.8% of all wide receiver 1 scoring seasons have come from players that were the first wide receiver selected on their team. 15.9% have been the wide receiver 2 in ADP from their team, and just 7 of the 132 have been lower than that. Rich is looking at this from the perspective of a top 12 season. I'm looking at it from a perspective of beating ADP expectation. But both are coming to the exact same conclusion. You want team wide receiver 1s. So the question then becomes, do you want that player to be the obvious wide receiver 1 on his team, or do you want his teammates to be drafted close to him? Which would tell us that the situation is really, really ambiguous. Because remember, the ambiguous RB1 theory states that when you're looking for ambiguous backfields to target, you should be attacking middle round team RB1s who have teammates who are also being selected in the middle rounds. Is that the case for wide receivers? Well, if anything, the opposite would be the case. Over the last 10 years, we've seen 72 team wide receiver 1s drafted in the middle rounds. We know that already. Of those 72, 15 of them had a wide receiver teammate drafted with them in those middle rounds. So 57 of them had a wide receiver 2 teammate drafted in the double-digit rounds. Of the 15 with a wide receiver teammate also selected in the middle rounds with them, the hit rate was just 6.7%. That's the same as the non-wide receiver 1s drafted in the middle rounds. Meanwhile, the breakout hit rate for the wide receiver 1s without a teammate drafted near them was a little over 14%. This may seem to suggest that you want more standalone wide receiver 1s in the middle rounds. The problem is, unlike running backs, there's another position that can influence our wide receivers' output, and that's tight end. If you include tight ends in our sample, the rates converge a little bit more. To put this another way, if you pretend that a tight end in the earlier middle rounds is like a wide receiver in the middle rounds, the hit rate for a wide receiver 1 with a teammate being drafted near him grows. Or you could just think of it this way. I know this is kind of confusing, just hear me out. Team wide receiver 1s are better than team wide receiver 2s. Of the team wide receiver 1 subset, the data says that we shouldn't want a teammate drafted around that wide receiver 1, unless that teammate is a tight end. In fact, of the 22 wide receivers who have had no wide receiver teammates drafted around them, but where they did have a tight end teammate drafted in the single-digit rounds, we saw 4 wide receivers hit. That's a hit rate of 18%. That was the most significant hit rate that I found when looking at teammate situations by ADP. Now, there's likely some noise to this data. Part of me thinks that the hypothesis as to why this is a thing would be that good quarterbacks, and I'm not saying good quarterbacks by ADP, but good quarterbacks may be utilizing their tight ends more, because tight ends aren't usually a quarterback's first option. So it tells us that the quarterback is going through his reads efficiently to get to that tight end, and therefore he's a good quarterback, because he can progress through his reads. That's probably somewhat of a stretch though. Maybe you guys can come up with the logic behind the data, but in the end, I think the data that matters is the wide receiver 1 versus the non-wide receiver 1 thing. You want team wide receiver 1s over team wide receiver 2s. They're hitting at a more substantial rate throughout your draft. So what about age? How does age play into all this? In the study done last year, I noted that age seemed to matter, but it seemed to matter from the perspective of how big the breakout was. Meaning if it was a given that a wide receiver broke out, if he was younger, that breakout was more significant. He exceeded ADP by more points. Rather than looking at the degree of the breakout, what I'm more interested in today is looking at the breakout rates of different ages. How often do rookies break out? What about third-year players or fourth-year players? That's going to set us up better to grasp the age side of things. If you look at our entire sample of wide receivers drafted after round 5, and you section off that sample by year in the league, one of the lower breakout hit rates is actually for rookie wide receivers. Since 2011, 5.4% of rookie wide receivers drafted after round 5 have broken out. That number jumps to 6.3% for second-year players. It's 4.3% for third-year guys, and then it jumps to almost 9% for fourth-year guys. And then something interesting happens. The breakout rate starts to peak for fifth and sixth-year players. Over the last 10 years, 11.4% of all fifth-year wide receivers drafted have given us a performance where they exceeded ADP expectation by 100 or more points. With sixth-year guys, that number was 15%. Now, before we get super excited about this, we have to remember a few things about the data that we're working with. First off, this is not saying that fifth and sixth-year wide receivers are better than other wide receivers when you factor out cost. All of the stuff that I'm referring to today is in reference to average draft position. It's in reference to the market. Now, to that point, keep in mind how fantasy managers behave. Remember the things that fantasy managers do in drafts. When it gets to be the later rounds, who are you thinking about drafting? The veteran wide receivers with a large sample size under their belt, or the rookies or the second-year players with more variance attached to their profiles? It's almost always the latter. We want more variance in the later rounds of our drafts. The truth is, fewer wide receivers in general will make it to year 5 or year 6 of their careers. In fact, since 2011, we've seen a total of 139 fifth and sixth year wide receivers drafted in fantasy football. And that's within our sample of wide receivers drafted after pick 60. If you only look at rookie wide receivers, that number is 147. So we've been drafting more rookie wide receivers over the last 10 years than fifth and sixth year wide receivers. Even though we're looking at how these players performed against expectation, so many rookies are being drafted late as dart throws. 133 of the 147 rookies that have been drafted have been double-digit round picks. We're basically saying, yeah, sure, maybe he's going to work out. Whereas with the veteran guys, we kind of already know the type of player that they are. So there's far less guessing. So plenty of rookies are probably giving you zeros, and that drives this number down. Whereas that doesn't happen nearly as often with veteran wide receivers. If you look strictly at the middle rounds to give us a more apples to apples comparison, so rounds 6 through 9, things change a little bit. In the middle rounds, rookie wide receivers have a hit rate of about 7%. The sample size is pretty small, with just 14 wide receivers getting selected in rounds 6 through 9 since 2011 within this subset. One of them has exceeded expectation by 100 or more points, and that was Mike Evans. Second-year wide receivers, they've had a hit rate of 12.5%. So in the middle rounds, rookie and second-year wide receivers have a higher hit rate than what their hit rate was overall. Why? Likely because of what I said before. We're throwing a lot of darts at first and second-year wide receivers in the late rounds. And a lot of those players are going to give you zeros for the entire season. But in the middle rounds, there's just naturally higher expectation for younger players. They're likely early round NFL draft picks who are going to see the field. When you look at third-year wide receivers in the middle rounds, they have a 0% hit rate, meaning 0 third-year wideouts since 2011 who have been drafted in rounds 6 through 9 have exceeded expectation by 100 or more points. And fourth-year wide receivers have not done that much better. Fifth-year wide receivers get us back to about 12%. And then six-year guys, and there have been 15 of them, but six-year guys have absolutely crushed it through the years. 5 of the 15 six-year wideouts have exceeded expectation by 100 or more points. Now again, maybe there's going to be some noise to this. I would actually say there's almost definitely noise to this specific year. That sixth-year wide receivers are this much better compared to the market when placed next to a fifth-year or seventh-year wide receiver. Because players from year 7 through year 10, they haven't hit at all. 38 players have gone in the middle rounds who have been year 7 through year 10 guys. None of them have been breakout wide receivers. It would then seem a little bit naive to think that drafting sixth-year wide receivers is like some obvious way to win fantasy titles, when just a year later, things are so bad. Now, I will say the degree in which these breakouts occur still seems to favor early career wideouts. If you look at the double-digit rounds or the late rounds, rookie wide receivers have an average difference in ADP expectation of about -8 points, meaning rookie wide receivers being drafted late on average aren't giving you a good return. That's kind of to be expected for the reasons that I just talked about. What's interesting is that even though 1 of 14 rookie wide receivers drafted in the middle rounds gave us a true breakout season, which is not a very high hit rate, middle round rookie wide receivers have exceeded expectation on average by about 25 fantasy points. To put this another way, these middle round rookies aren't really breaking out, but they're exceeding expectation pretty regularly. Of the 14 taken in the middle rounds, 9 were able to exceed ADP expectation. Meanwhile, this data sort of confirms that second-year wide receivers are a goldmine for fantasy football, especially middle round second-year wide receivers. In terms of just general hit rate in the middle rounds, only sixth-year wide receivers were better than second-year wide receivers. But then on top of that, second-year wide receivers exceeded expectation on average at the highest rate among all career seasons. Let me put this another way. First and second year wide receivers have the second highest and highest average in terms of ADP expectation. Sixth year wide receivers are third. So in the middle rounds, those younger players are exceeding expectation by a good number on average. But considering second year wide receivers also have the second highest breakout rate, it tells you that not only are they breaking out, but they're doing so by a larger margin than the other subsets. Let me phrase this in a more concise way. Rookie wide receivers aren't breaking out at a super high rate, no matter where you're drafting them. But on average, they're still exceeding expectation in the middle rounds at a decently high rate. The difference with a second-year wide receiver is that not only are they averaging a higher point total above expectation, but they're also breaking out at a higher rate. So you really want second-year wide receivers. Year 3 and 4 wide receivers tend to do pretty poorly according to this data, especially when looking at the middle rounds where the samples are more apples to apples. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that these players are middle and late round picks, so they're clearly not good, or they're not elite. But had they broken out in year 1 or year 2, they likely wouldn't have the ADPs that they have. They'd be higher draft picks. It's as if they're being drafted with a lot of hope in mind. That's a little bit different compared to a player in year 5, 6, or 7. A true veteran like those players, they're just not sexy picks. They're players who likely have given us something in the past, but they're being perceived as players who can't really hit because they're further along in their careers. They're just not fun picks. And there's some truth to that, but they do tend to outperform the market. So let's recap all this. I just brain vomited a ton of information into your ears, and I'm sure it's hard to keep up. We know that breakout wide receivers tend to not come from nowhere. The year before their breakout, they typically had a reasonably high target share. We also know that quarterback ADP isn't really relevant for a wide receiver to break out. We know that breakout wide receivers are coming from ambiguous wide receiver situations. The exact type of situation is not totally clear, but we do know that we want team wide receiver ones at the very least. And it seems like team wide receiver ones who have a tight end only being drafted with them in the single digit rounds, those players seem to crush. Either that or team wide receiver ones without a wide receiver being drafted near them from their team. But as a baseline, we want wide receiver ones. And lastly, second year wide receivers are the best bet in the middle rounds, while veterans like year 5 to 7 guys are the best bet to exceed expectation throughout all rounds. Year 1 and 2 wide receivers tend to break out more substantially in those middle rounds. Year 3 and 4 wide receivers don't. And then year 5 through 7 wide receivers are generally safe investments versus the market. So what does that mean for 2021? Well, one player who really stands out who fits this criteria is Michael Pittman. Best Ball ADP has him as a top 100 pick right now. He's a year 2 player, and he's being drafted as his team's wide receiver 1. His quarterback doesn't have a high ADP either. The only piece of breakout criteria he doesn't totally fit is the coming from nowhere thing. But he was banged up last year, and he still saw 11.4% of Indianapolis's targets across 13 games. Michael Pittman seems like a fairly good choice. And honestly, as difficult as it is for me to say this because I just more subjectively don't believe in it, Henry Ruggs fits this criteria pretty well too. He just has similar issues to what Michael Pittman has. Now, ADP can change a whole lot from now until August, and the data that I work with focuses on August drafts. But if Jerry Jeudy starts to separate himself from Courtland Sutton in ADP, then he seems like a fairly obvious breakout candidate as well as the team wide receiver 1 from Denver. We'll just see how things look from an ADP perspective as we get closer to seasonal draft time. Now, there aren't a ton of veterans being drafted as their team's wide receiver 1 in the mid to late rounds this year. But I think Brandon Cooks is one who you could pinpoint and say that he fits what I talked about on today's show pretty well. We have no idea what his quarterback situation is going to look like. He has no wide receiver teammates being drafted near him. He's being drafted as his team's wide receiver 1, and he has a target share backbone from last year. He's the obvious veteran pick. And then even though rookie wide receivers don't pan out at a high rate in the middle rounds in terms of being true breakouts, Devontae Smith is definitely someone to watch. Remember, rookie wide receivers in the middle rounds still beat their ADP by a high number of points compared to the alternative. They just didn't hit that 100 mark very often. Devontae Smith, with a tight end being drafted with him in the single-digit rounds and no teammate wide receiver to be seen near him in ADP, he sort of makes sense. And Elijah Moore works for similar reasons. Just like the running back episode from last week, I think one takeaway with all of this could also be what not to look for. We shouldn't love team wide receiver threes. We shouldn't love year 3 or year 4 players versus their cost. We shouldn't love wide receivers who are just being drafted on hope. So even if there aren't obvious players to target, maybe you walk away from listening to this and you second guess a player that you've been drafting a lot this offseason. That can be just as impactful. Just remember though, we're looking at trends here. And I'd argue the trends are less concrete than the running back ones that we talked about last week. Even if that's the case, they're still going to help you gain an edge over your competition. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.